Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, the Good Friday program here, and we're just continuing with our overview of the world, the crumbling of the U.S. strategic position, which has promise, but it also, of course, has dangers because the depraved, degenerate Anglo-American elites tend to respond to things like this sort of the way the British did in 1914, that is to gin up a conflict, and that, of course, can the sky's the limit in today's world. We've talked about Russia to some extent. We've talked about Iraq. We've talked about Afghanistan. We're doing Iran. Now, Iran, the main thing, of course, is that the color revolution has failed. This color revolution that had been built up all during Bush's second term and into Obama, and with Obama's pretty face, it was thought that this would then turn into a puppet regime which would cut off oil to China and start quarrels with Russia. Well, that's a failure now. The color revolution has fallen flat, and the Russian contractors are once again building the Bushehr nuclear reactor. Now, the thing concentrated this past week about sanctions. We had Sarkozy, the desperate demagogue, coming to Washington, and together with Obama, another desperate demagogue, they took part in a press conference of posturing and bombastic statements about what they were going to do to Iran. Both of them, of course, in a severe political crisis. Sarkozy just lost his regional elections. He's much weakened. He had to give up his cap-and-trade program as an indication. And Obama, of course, Obama is now, he's got more than 50% of the U.S. population against him in the recent poll. So they say, let's try some posturing on the Iranian sanctions front, and we'll try to get some popularity that way. This is something you see in Weimar, something you see with Brüning himself, who came into office 80 years ago. The sanctions. Now, on Thursday of this week, we had Ms. Rice, the unfortunate U.S. representative at the United Nations, saying that China had agreed to serious negotiations about sanctions concerning Iran. And the Chinese Foreign Ministry, there was a whole huge flap with Hillary Clinton crowing that China had come on board. They were beginning to see the light on the necessity for sanctions, and a media flap around the world. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said nothing has changed. We have not changed our position. We don't prefer sanctions. We want diplomacy, not sanctions or anything else. Nevertheless, there is a mood of hysterical gloating in the State Department where they actually think that something is going to happen here. You've also got President Hu of China coming to Washington for this so-called nuclear security summit on the 12th and the 13th. Well, on one level, that's a photo opportunity, right? That's just a big show. On the other hand, watch out what you wish for, because if we look at what Prime Minister Wen of China was able to do in breaking up and blocking the monstrosity of the Copenhagen carbon dictatorship summit, he blocked it very effectively. President Hu coming into Washington may be here to block whatever Obama wants, or to oppose it at least, in terms of this demagogic nuclear security summit. Remember, the whole purpose of the nuclear security summit is to provide a cloak for U.S. attacks on Iran so that you can cloak it with the general world interest in non-proliferation rather than having it be simply the vendetta of the U.S. against yet another country that's willing to stand up to them. So concerning the sanctions, I just don't see China coming on board for sanctions. They're as likely to sabotage these talks as they are to promote them. There's no idea that they would negotiate in good faith. They have not said that they would. Therefore, Ms. Rice and her friends at the British Foreign Office seem to have pulled some kind of an April Fool's Day prank, as I said in the commentary on Russia Today, that you can see on my website by the time we have this radio program going out. So the idea also is that if Hu is coming, it means that he won't be declared a currency manipulator on April 15th. So maybe that's also what he's aiming at, because the Chinese, for various reasons of losing face, and it's of course a weakness, but they don't want this So the Washington Post says it would appear that they won't be labeled currency manipulators on the 15th if they were here for the Nuclear Security Summit on the 12th and the 13th. So that stuff is sort of open-ended, but I don't think there's any basis for the hysteria and gloating going on the U.S. side. And indeed, look what they're doing. Not just that China is taking over parts of Afghanistan right under the noses of the U.S. occupying force. The U.S. forces are out in the countryside chasing so-called Taliban, where the Chinese are in the cities making economic development deals and improving their presence. It shows that the Anglo-American method of empire, right, using air power, bombing, anti-terror, war on terror, and so forth, this method simply doesn't work, and the Chinese have a much better, much more effective method, which is welcomed in most places around the world. The other thing, the Treasury auctions last week, as I believe we said, the Chinese did not show up, and that meant that there was a lack of demand. The bid-to-cover ratio on those Treasury auctions deteriorated noticeably, meaning that the prices of these bonds went down, and the interest rate the U.S. had to pay jumped up, and it was quite a jump. A third of a percent, 30, 40 basis points, is a significant jump for a bond market, which usually doesn't jump around quite as much as stocks do. So that was a warning. And then, of course, the Chinese in Afghanistan, and indeed in Iraq, because it would be hard to see Maliki having enough largesse to grease his coalition if it weren't for Iranian input, but also then Chinese input. Let's look at Pakistan. In Pakistan, we mentioned it before, the Pakistanis were instrumental in getting this terrorist, this essentially a NATO terrorist, Rigi of Jundullah, arrested, forced down, and taken into custody by the Iranians some weeks ago. So that was a gesture of independence by Pakistan. The question here is the U.S. hold weakening? Well, we've just had a week or 10 days of strategic reevaluation between the U.S. and Pakistan, and I think the effect of this is that the Pakistanis have been able to get their hands on more military hardware. It looks to me some heavy weapons, or heavier than usual at least, so that there is a sign of independence there as well. The other thing to look for is this Taliban captive, Baridar, top Taliban leader that the Pakistanis have captured. And, of course, the CIA immediately shows up and says, turn him over to us, send him to Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. We're going to give him the third degree. And the Pakistanis say no. For 2 whole weeks, they wouldn't let anybody from the CIA talk to him, and they're being very, very reserved in making him available. So we have all of this. Obama has issued more or less an ultimatum to Zardari that the U.S. Demands to have access to these people, and a series of other things that are demanded. So I think Pakistan is also on the path of greater independence and less subservience. So we've seen now that the color revolution in Iran failed. The one in Ukraine has been it's been essentially rolled back. It's been mopped up. It's finished. Let's look at the Israelis before we go too much further. The Israelis, the U.S. demand on the Israelis and the flap of Obama and Netanyahu is basically this. We mentioned before in connection with Iraq, the U.S. goal in the Middle East now is to assemble a coalition of dupes and puppets and kamikaze assets. It would be the Arab-Sunni front, again, against the Iranian-Persian Shiite front. And the Israelis are supposed to make concessions to the Arabs in this so that the U.S. gets what they want. And, of course, the reactionary aggressor and warmonger, Netanyahu, says, no, I won't do that, and therefore gets into these clashes with Obama. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio.